Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning in our inaugural talk, G-Talk, sponsored by the Reuben P. Job Institute for Spiritual Formation. G-Talk is a space for soulful conversation. It's about engaging in God talk in a manner that is personal, practical, embodied, and open-ended. We hope that through this conversation this morning, we will all get a glimpse of the myriad ways we experience the divine God intersecting with our quotidian life. But before we begin, I'd like to lead us through a simple contemplative exercise called Receiving God's Compassion Meditation. To begin, let us find a comfortable position with our eyes slightly open or gently closed. And as your body settles, notice the breath coming in and the breath going out. Follow the breath with your awareness and not to try to change it in any way. Just breathing in, a gentle hold, and breathing out. Breathing in, feeling the breath as it passes through your nostrils, and breathing out, feeling the breath as it leaves through your mouth. Keep your awareness lightly and gently on your breath. And let your body breathe you. Whenever you find yourself getting lost in your head or getting overwhelmed, that's okay. No problem, no judgment, no shame. Just gently draw your attention back to the sensation of your breathing. Now, friends, picture yourself in the crowd whom Jesus saw and felt compassion towards. Notice his brown-skinned face, his loving gaze, and imagine him walking towards you. And you feel his tenderness. You feel his warmth and open stance. And you experience his nearness and the assurance that he is there with you today at this moment. And while continuing to breathe mindfully, you hear the words of Christ. Come to me, all of you who are weary, and I will give you rest. Come to me, all of you who are weary, and I will give you rest. Linger here for a moment and lean into this very promise. As you consent to this invitation, you become aware of aspects of your life that needs the compassionate touch of God. Name them one by one and offer them up to God in humility, reverence, and gratitude. And let the warmth of God's compassion make you feel light, accompanied, strengthened, and deeply cared for. Breathe in God's compassionate love. Breathe out God's liberating light. Breathing in God's compassionate love and breathing out God's liberating light. As we bring this mindfulness exercise to an end, keeping your eyes slightly opened or gently closed for just a little while longer, take a moment to notice how you're feeling. Take a moment to notice your body and your mind and spirit. Let us slowly come back into this space, aware of our body in the chair if we're sitting, still breathing deeply, and then with intention, approach our time together with curiosity, hospitality, and loving kindness. The Lord be with you.
So with you.
We are very blessed this morning to have Reverend Dr. Javier A. Viera as our first guests. Reverend Dr. Viera is President and Professor of Education and Leadership here at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary. President Viera is a native of San Juan, Puerto Rico, and an extraordinary pastor, teacher, and administrator. Welcome, President Viera, to our G-Talk this morning.
Thank you, Rolf, and thank you for this invitation, but thank you also for launching this important project and series of conversations, which I know are going to be an incredible blessing to so many people, hopefully over the years to come. So thank you for your work on this.
Thank you for joining us today and for what Garrett is trying to do in terms of really lifting up the role of spirituality in who we are and what we do. And so let's dive right in, President Viera, if you don't mind, because
let's go for it.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So take us back to your early years and maybe describe for us your first experiences of the divine, of God.
Yeah, you know, I'm one of these folks who I can't remember a time when I wasn't captured by the spiritual life. And I don't say that as to say that I'm a spiritual giant. I just always have been fascinated by it, intrigued by it. And when I think about the first memory that I have of the divine, or feeling like I was in the presence of the divine, having some sort of awareness around that, it was actually at my oldest brother's first communion. We were in church, and I remember it like it was yesterday. And I remember the music, the sense of the community. But I remember more than anything just watching what was happening up front, watching the role of the priest in preparing the communicants who were coming, in the words, and celebrating the Mass. And I remember going home that day and setting up in my bedroom, setting up a little altar, and kind of mimicking, if you will, in a Girardian sense. I was trying to mimic and again kind of replay the experience. And I think that what I was trying to do was not so much see myself in that role, even though down the road that is the role that I would occupy, but it was really about creating the space where I still felt that experience, that presence, that sense of the sacred. And I would say that that's the first conscious memory that I have of Christ becoming very real to me. But as I was thinking about this question, when you told me you were going to start by asking me this, I remembered a retreat. I was on a guided retreat at a monastery in Massachusetts a few years back. And my spiritual director on the retreat asked me to close my eyes and to think about, so he has tried to conjure up an image of the first time that you felt like you were being embraced by God. What does that look like? And he told me, sit quietly and then describe that image to me. And the image that came up to me as I was thinking was, I, as a kid, I, grew up with my grandmother, my brothers and I did. And every night I would go to bed, I would fall asleep on her lap in her rocking chair at 8 o'clock, she would start watching her telenovelas. And that's what she was doing. And I would be in her lap, in her embrace. So she would hold me so that I wouldn't slide off. And that's the moment that came up for me, was being that close to her, being in her presence, being embraced by her. And then the memory of her at some point when I always kind of woke up as she was carrying me to my bed and putting me to sleep. And I would say that there's something powerful about that kind of love and care that my grandmother gave me, that I think gave me the first sense that I was loved by God and that I was in God's presence.
Wow. And it came through within the context of community through that experience that you have at a church, and then embodied by your grandmother.
Absolutely.
Wow.
This is actually why I feel so strongly that Christianity is an incarnational faith, and why the incarnation is, for me, the central spiritual and theological concept through which we see the world. And often we talk about the incarnation as if it happened once. And I would say that it absolutely happened uniquely in the person of Christ, but that God continues to manifest God's self to us in the people who God sends to us in our lives, and that God is made known to us. I believe this deeply in very tangible, real ways. Richard Rohr often talks about the first incarnation, which is creation itself, right? And that God was first revealed to humankind through the created natural order. And then the second incarnation, or the Christ event, is the culmination of the incarnation event. And I believe that too. I believe very powerfully that God is made known to us constantly, everywhere, in encounters, in meals shared, in walks that we take, so I could go on and on, but I believe this deeply. It's my own experience.
Well, it sounds like when we talk about Christian spirituality, we see and understand that as a lived experience, that somehow it's not fully holy and only transcendent, that there is a permeation of God's presence in the concreteness of our lives. And that seems to be your experience of the divine. It happened within the context of community, which you ended up mimicking, almost like you're enacting what your life would be in the future, which you are now inhabiting. You're once a pastor, now a president, a spiritual shepherd of the Garrett community, and doing God's work. And that's amazing that you're able to connect spirituality and how that infuses your daily life. President Javier, you mentioned spiritual direction and relationship with your grandmother as a portal into the divine. I wonder if, because of that, there are other spiritual practices that you have somehow been engaging with as a way of deepening your spiritual life. And what would that be? What would those be?
Yeah. For me, the most regular and persistent throughout my adult life has been, and I'm not perfect about it, but I try most days to pray the daily office. So I will, I have a number of prayer books that are meaningful to me and that I use regularly. Sometimes, they get to the point where they feel stale, and so I'll go to the other one. But I feel like that is my most consistent and present spiritual practice. And the reason that it's meaningful for me is because I think I've always struggled with prayer and what prayer is. And probably because of the religious tradition that I grew up in, I felt like prayer was supposed to feel a certain way and it had to sound a certain way. And there was pressure. I mean, I remember every time I would was appointed to a congregation or to a different setting, one of the things they would always ask you to do is, will you pray to open or will you pray to close? And I remember always being aware that while, yes, it was an appropriate way to close, they were really listening for, does he sound like he knows how to pray? Does he sound like he prays regularly? Does he sound like, what we want our minister to sound like? And it always felt very performative. And so what the daily office does for me is that it puts me in a space and it puts words in my mouth and in my mind that I don't know that I would otherwise choose on my own because of my own limitations, my own selfishness, my own, if we could use the word sinfulness, right? I mean, in a theological sense, I think that the discipline of praying the daily office, praying for people for whom it's hard for me to pray for, or praying for situations that I too easily in the busyness of my own life forget and they recede from being present to me. And the church in its words brings this back into my consciousness, brings this back into my presence and forces me in a good, and I use that in a positive way, forces me to be intentional about thinking beyond myself and beyond my own proclivities and my own preoccupations and anxieties, and squarely places me in what I believe is the mind of God and the heart of God, and brings me into that space so that I can be bigger than I would allow myself to be, and so that I can be take on the mind of Christ, if you will, in a way that I don't instinctively or naturally do. So that's why for me, that particular discipline is so important to me. I'll tell you, during the pandemic, the hardest part for me spiritually, I think, has been the inability of taking and participating in Eucharist in a community regularly. That is for me, a very central practice for me, very intentionally so. Every church that I've ever served, we celebrated the Eucharist weekly at least one of our services. And I think that kind of sacramental presence for me is how I understand one of the central ways in which I understand my own spirituality, but how I connect and experience God and the living Christ and God's Spirit in my life. And to be distanced from that, I think, has created a pretty deep absence in my life. And so I'm ready for the world in part to open up so that kind of experience can be part of my daily. Doing it at home, it doesn't feel the same. A couple of churches that I attended online would say, get your elements and do it. It wasn't the same. It didn't work for me. So
it sounds like the daily office is praying you or praying on behalf of you. And that the Eucharist also is the place where you are most acutely aware of the communal relational aspect of being followers of Christ. I wonder though, President Viera, if you can maybe help us a little bit more around the spiritual practices that you have been engaging in. How much of that is a reflection of who you are, your personality?
Here I'm talking to my therapist now, huh? The psychologist in you is coming out. That's a really good question, Rolf. Like I said, I mean, I think that in many ways, not for anything that I did, but I was a spiritually precocious kid and was always kind of compelled by it. I have wrestled with my own sense of faith and what I believe and how that should manifest itself in my life and in the world through my work. And so, I don't know how to answer that, but what I would say is that here's the way, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but here's how I'm going to get at it. And it's that, if I had another spiritual discipline, one of the things that I'm not an incredibly disciplined person, right? I mean, it takes work for me to stay at disciplines. And one of the ones that I have tried to be much more intentional about is finding spaces of just as much silence and stillness as I possibly can find. And one of the things that I realized is that, and again, it was actually, on a retreat through Richard Rohr's Center for Action and Contemplation, where I did my first contemplative sit. And there was something in the moment of when I allowed myself to be completely and entirely still and silent, where I felt like I was getting dizzy, right? I mean, there was something that it was a physical manifestation to allowing myself to just rid myself of all of my thoughts, of all of those, all of those little, you might say demons that are like, telling me things, that like, distractions, concerns, anxieties. But letting myself get to that moment of complete and utter stillness. And it was disorienting. But then what I realized, the more and more I did it, it kept happening. And what I learned and what I've come to trust or believe is that I'm being drawn into that silence. Someone, however we want to talk about it, I don't even know how to talk about it, is drawing me into that silence, because I know that if I allow myself to go there, I'm going to be open to things. I'm going to discover things. I'm going to hear things, spiritually speaking, that the busyness of my life doesn't let me. I will feel things. Things will come to my mind that the busyness and the distractions of my life otherwise won't let me. And so it's that discipline of allowing myself to be kind of lured or pulled in, dragged sometimes against my will there, that I think is one of the places where I experience the divine presence. And is that a part of who I am, or is that something that I do? I don't know. That's a really good question that we're going to have to find some time in your office to unpack some more.
It could be both. I think when you talked about being lured to this space within, Thomas Merton talks about infused contemplation, that somehow it's a grace, an expression of God's grace upon us that really invites us into a different realm of being where nothing is required really, but our openness and consent to God's invitation, of stillness and silence. And
beautiful. It's a beautiful way of putting it.
I find you, not even through this, and not this is not because you're the guest here, but there is a sense of quiet confidence in you, a gentleness, and I think because I'm also trying to learn and to live a contemplative life. And there's an element of introversion, not a requirement, but an introversion that is needed for that to fully flourish. So thank you for just allowing us to really see a different side of you, and really wanting to get us to some of your really personal and unique experiences about the divine. This next question is also something that we think about and not really talked about openly, but we're curious to hear some of the obstacles to your journey in faith that you have encountered along the way. What are some of those things that deter you from deepening or engaging more deeply into the life of faith?
Yeah, I think if I'm exceptionally honest, I have to start with one of the obstacles for me has been me. I was preaching this weekend, and I used a quote from Chesterton, who was asked, what's wrong with the world? To write an essay on that, and he asked the question, "What's wrong with the world?" And his answer was me. And it wasn't like a self-castigating kind of thing. It was a realization that let me talk about more personally about how I do it. For me, it's a realization that I often get in my own way. I often allow, either through the choices that I make of the places I choose to be, how I choose to prioritize my time, my relationships, right? I don't look often enough to create the spaces where I know that I get life, where God is present to me in very real, palpable ways, right? Reminds me of something that, one of my mentors, Peter Gomes, used to say all the time. He says, we play hard and we work harder than we ever have before, not because we're more industrious or more talented than our predecessors, but because of the fear that if we stop, we will be overwhelmed by our anxieties and our fears. And so we just keep going and keep going. And so I think that in that way, I am an obstacle to my own deepening spiritual engagement by the choices that I make. I think that over time, I'm getting more aware and more conscious, more deliberate about that, but it's still an obstacle. I would have to say that in many ways, as much as I am a man of the church, a person of the church, I am a minister of the church, and I very much am proud of that and feel connected to that. But the church has often been an obstacle, right? It has in the way that I feel like it limits grace from working powerfully and fully the way that it chooses to regularly obsess about who's in and who's out, rather than pushing ourselves to embody the immenseness of God's mercy and God's love in the world, right? And the way that we infight with one another rather than build each other up. I think sometimes I feel like the church is an obstacle to faith, and I want desperately for that not to be the case. And part of our work, as faculty members here in preparing religious leaders, is I want to be a part of preparing future leaders who actually aren't beholden to that approach or that kind of the church's presence in the world, but are fearless in how grace and mercy are operative in our lives, in our relationships, and in our world. So I think that those are two obstacles that I think come to mind right away. I could go on, but
and if I could have a follow-up question there, President Viera, what are some of the things that you have done to help you ensure that you don't get in the way your walk with the Lord? What are some of the things that, as a community of faith, beginning here at Garrett, what can we do to make sure that we transcend, overcome, resist spaces where there are exclusionary measures?
Yeah. I think that the way that I have tried to become more conscious and more intentional around this, Rolf, is and this, I think, becomes somewhat easier the older I get. I don't know why, but is to have a sense of like fearlessness about and I'm actually increasingly, I feel unapologetic about my Christian faith and about the worldview that I hold and how it informs everything that I see. I think that for many years I wrestled with it. I was embarrassed by it at times, or I was I tried to make excuses for it and had a kind of defensiveness around it, try to over justify its intellectual kind of gravitas, if you will. But I think that the older I get, like, none of that matters as much to me anymore. And what I try to do is just to be unapologetic about this is who I believe God is. This is how God has revealed God's self to me and to the world in Christ. And it's a worldview that is completely transformative and life-changing. And I'm proud to embrace it, and I do embrace it. And it doesn't mean that it excludes others, or that it means, or it casts judgment on others. I think other people come to God differently than I do, but this is a way that has made sense to me, that has drawn me in and has made me a bigger version of myself in spiritually, intellectually, morally, you name it, relationally. And so I think that getting to the point where I am fearless and unapologetic around that, that's one thing. The other thing I think that I would say is I try to pay attention. One of the things that my other grandmother, I told you, I talk about my grandmothers a lot. My other grandmother taught me, and I shared this with the faculty, earlier when we began the school year, was that she lived a very kind of what we would now call a very porous and enchanted life. God was speaking to her everywhere, through everything and every encounter, right? And one of the things that she would say to us is, she would just to pay attention, right? I used the story of bringing her a fruit that wasn't ripe and off of the tree in the backyard, and she's scolding me, and I was like, how am I supposed to know? And she said, pay attention. The fruit will tell you when it's ready to be picked, right? Just pay attention. That's the kind of relationship that she had with her world. And I think that for me, that's something that I've tried to just become more aware of, is pay attention to not only where God is present, but where injustice is happening, where harm is taking place, where I'm the cause of that, or where I witness it and can speak to that, right? It's becoming much more intentional about being present to the now, right? And seeing the ways in which God is in a moment, either being present to me through the simplest thing, through a fruit, through a tree, right? Through a conversation like you and I are having. To me, this is very much a spirit moment, this conversation that we're having, right? Or where God's calling me to have some sort of courage and bravery, and to be part of making something right, rather than enabling to persist in being wrong or harmful.
The power of attention.
Yes, that's a great way of saying it.
And intention as well. President Viera, we are in the middle of the pandemic right now. And you've talked about the Eucharist, something that you've missed when we were locked in our homes for 18 months. we're in the middle of it right now, not only of COVID-19, but also of racial unrest and various forms of cruelty and violence. What spiritual resources have you been drawing from that have sustained you during this chaotic moment? And what might the community do and think and consider as we begin to live a different life because of where we're at right now?
Yeah, for me, I think of again, it's a very relational thing, but as hard as the pandemic has been for so many people, in some ways, it's also been a gift. And one of the ways in which it was a gift is the ways in which, because we were closed in our homes, right, locked up in our homes, our families spent much more time together. And for my family, that was a beautiful gift, right? I had a daughter who was about to go off to college, and I got, these 18 months of just undivided attention. Sometimes she probably felt too much, right? But to kind of think about how we were in relationship with each other as a family, what we were doing together, how we were present to one another, how we had to think more intentionally about sharing space with one another, right? And to think that, that we have been given to one another as a gift from God. How do we treasure this gift, right? And so I would say that my family became a place of a spiritual resource for me to think about my life and in ways in which maybe if I was always running around and going places I wasn't doing. The other one was being more intentional about spiritual friendships. I have, I can say I have two friends that I would say are spiritual companions to me, where I can be brutally honest in myself, and who will speak truth to me in the ways that maybe other people feel they can't. But being intentional about seeking out that kind of engagement, and people who I know are praying for me, people who I know think about me and I them in response, and that even though we're not regularly together or seeing each other, that we know that we're in each other's lives because there's an intentionality around that. And so seeking that kind of connection. I learned very late in life that I was an introvert. I think that because of the job, the role that I was in as the pastor of local congregations, I felt this performative pressure to always be extroverted and to be gregarious. And I don't know how good I was at it, but I know that I did it. I performed it, and it never felt authentic. It never felt real. And in some ways, the pandemic gave me space to kind of think that through and think about why I was in the world in that way, and to recenter myself. And in that sense, it was a real gift. And these people that I'm describing to you are people who hold me accountable, who encourage me, who help me to find and express, my true personhood, my true identity in ways that, for either because I was fearful or insecure or uncertain, whatever, I was reticent to in the past. I think that in that sense, during this time, that kind of relationship has been incredibly important to me.
Here again, President Viera, thank you for highlighting and lifting up the power of relationships in really nurturing our relationship with God, and in the process, deepening our relationship with one another. And that is a theme that I've been hearing from you since we started this conversation, is that spirituality is really connected to our lived experience. And that part of that is being in a relationship with one another.
Yeah.
And we draw grace, and we draw faith and hope and strength and courage from one another. And thank you for going back to that theme, because often spirituality has become so individualized that we use it as a way to expand our ego consciousness, which is really I think, another conversation that we could have.
Yeah, but this is, let me say something as you're talking. I feel like I have to say this. I said this early on when I came here. I shared at our town hall that one of the disciplines that I was taking on over the course of this year was to read the Bible from beginning to end, right? I've never done that. I had never done that. And I mean, and I'll be honest with you, there are big gaps where I just have not been able to stay at that. But one of the things that's happened during this time is I feel like I have fallen in love with scripture again. And I've fallen in love with it in a very different way. I have fallen in love with it. And this is picking up on what you were just saying, Rolf. I have fallen in love with these stories and with these people again. But now, for the first time in my life, I think, as conversation partners, as people who are kind of who have walked the road and now are somehow walking it with me as well. The power of these stories, the depth, the insight, the wisdom of these stories. And I think that I've come to scripture in a very different way than I ever have before. And I've fallen in love with it again. And it's life-giving in a way that previously it wasn't. And I'm very, very grateful for that.
That's a powerful word, falling in love with scripture again. And when we fall in love, there is this energy, right? Excitement. It's so bodily. And I like it that you actually using that to describe your experience of the scripture. Thank you for getting me excited about these things. I'd like to call in Myron Chris, because we do have people listening in. I'm sure have some questions for you. Myron Chris, what do we have for Dr. Viera at this time?
First, by way of introduction, I am Myron Chris, MK. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a doctoral student here at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary. And we invite you to now open up your Q&A section on the bottom of your screen and to post any questions that you might have for President Viera. So I have a few if we don't have any that come up, but I am seeing some pop up. We have about 10 minutes for this section. So if you have a burning question, just go ahead and type that in now, and we'll get through as many as possible. And we will not say your name. So if you are self-conscious, not wanting to say your name, then know that that will not be shared. First question, and we'll see. I have not reread this, so we're going to see what it says. You are the first Latina president at Garrett, and I believe that many first women queer POC will come from Garrett. What story does your body tell when walking through our halls or when you are meeting with faculty, students, etc.? What advice would you give as we begin to innovate the way we quote unquote do ministry, enter ministries, etc.?
This is one of those questions that I think is going to have me going back to my grandmother's wisdom, right? That these hallways speak, these windows, these walls have stories to be told, and these new stories are being created each and every day as we inhabit these spaces together. And so, I think that one of the things that, if we can say it in the way that I hear as I walk in these hallways, is that this is a place where, and I'm gonna be preaching about this later today, but this is a place where courage has taken root, right? Garrett has been a place where I think that we're probably the only United Methodist Theological School that was founded by two women, Eliza Garrett and Lucy Ryder, right? I mean, that this has from its opening days been a place where the expansive will and love of God has been made manifest, right? Where people have always been kind of on, and I know this is an overused phrase, but I mean this in a very positive way, on the cutting edge of making sure that the fullness of God's people are given freedom and expression and leadership. And I know it hasn't always been perfect. No institution has that kind of history, but I'm proud that Garrett is that kind of place where people of not only, in the gender spectrum, but the racial, national, ethnic spectrum have found a home and have found a place where God can use them, God can form them, and can bring them into community with others who receive them, accept them, and see the power and the gift of God's Spirit at work in their lives. And that's one of the things that I think I feel most proud of, being a part of this community.
President Viera, you mentioned about, and this question talked about being in the halls of Garrett. How do you witness the divine in your role currently? You have lots of meetings and meetings and meetings. How do you experience the divine even in your role, your current role?
Yeah. I joke with some friends that, they ask me, like my friends who are not religious at all, it's like, so what does a seminary president do all day? And I'll joke, well, I look at spreadsheets all day, right? And there is some truth to that. But I also, I think that I experience the divine, honestly, in the conversations with my colleagues, like this moment with Rolf, right? Last night, I had dinner with another faculty member. And over the course of that conversation, I was very aware of that this wasn't simply a collegial conversation, but it was a spiritual conversation. And that we were, for a short moment of our individual journeys, we were walking that spiritual road together, right? I think that I think dreaming is very underrated. I think, and one of the things that I'm so excited about in this coming year here at Garrett is that there's going to be a lot of dreaming, a lot of visioning around what this community can be, what this community is being called to be, right? Where this community is being propelled by the Spirit of God to be, right? To be present and to its next institutional manifestation. And for me, that's deeply spiritual work. It's not just administrative work. And I think of it in that way. And so I think that those are some of the ways in which I experience the divine in my work day in and day out.
That's awesome. So with that, it sounds like a whole lot of work, a whole lot to manage. So what do you do for rest and relaxation?
Well, one of the things that I love to do most, and this is going to sound so cheesy, but I love walking my dogs. I mean, they're basically, feral and uncontrollable, but they bring our family just so much joy. And so most evenings I will go on an hour and a half long walk with them. And one of the things, and this gets to our earlier point, Rolf, about paying attention and being present. One of the things that I love about them is that they force me to notice things that if I were walking without them, I would never notice. They bring me, in some ways, because they are closer to the ground, they bring into my awareness and into my sphere things that I would miss altogether, and that often bring me a sense of joy and just momentary, if you will, hilarity that I would miss if I was just, walking on my own without them. But their company brings me into a different realm, a different consciousness, and a different sense of perception of what is. And I'm really grateful for that. So that's one thing that I would say.
That's awesome. So what is your vision for corporate worship as a seminary community in the chapel at Getz?
I'm often asked questions like this, and this isn't a trick. I really do mean this, and it's that I answer them like this, and it's that I have thoughts and I have a sense of what I would love to see happen, but the vision for what happens in the chapel or at Garrett has to be collectively held, and I won't be the one to cast that vision. I will be among those who are collectively casting that vision and building that reality. We're going to make the road by walking. You've heard me say that a lot. And I'm actually, I said earlier, I'm not a very disciplined person. I'm actually around that. I feel like I'm very disciplined. I want a lot of different voices. If you're asking me what I would love to see, I would love to see that space be filled with just exuberant joy. I would love for people to walk into that space, even if they're in there completely alone, and have it be a sense of where they know that God has met God's people in this space and something has happened here. And that it's palpable, that they sense it. At one of the churches that I served, we always had these votive candles in the front. And at first that was jarring to people. What's a Methodist church doing with votive candles? Isn't that what, we see in Catholic and Orthodox churches? But over time, what I became very appreciative of is that every little candle represented someone's intentionality and prayer that continued to burn and to fill the space long after they had left. And so I would love to see something like that in our space, so that, when Paul says pray without ceasing, I think that's one of the ways in which prayer is unceasing. It is always there. It's always present. And so it's little things like that I hope that the chapel becomes not only a place that is filled with life and prayer at 4:00 on a Wednesday, but that all day that is a space where that's taking place.
And we have that opportunity later today at 4:00.
That's right.
Sing a joyful noise.
That's right.
The chapel.
Another comment and question. I like your statement about spiritual obstruction, myself in church. As a pastor, I have struggled with it. I have seen many criticizing church from being out of, or cut off, I think it's supposed to say, or the church leaders that is power acting in autonomy without heeding to the voice of the congregation. My question to you is, how do you bridge this difference or the gap?
I want to make sure I understand the question. So bridge which gap? Can you help me through that? Without seeing it in front of me, it's hard to follow it.
The gap between the church and myself being an obstruction, I think is what this person is saying.
Well, I don't know if this is what our questioner is asking, but let me add to my previous answer, because as I'm thinking about how I answered it, I tended to fall into a way of speaking about the church that I don't like, even though I know I did it and I felt it, and it was honest. But it's that I speak about the church as if it's an entity in itself, whereas the church is us. The church is me, right? And so if the church is not expressing itself as I would hope that it would be, I am in part responsible for some portion of that, right? And so how I would, if I'm understanding the question, how I would bridge that gap is not simply to stand on the outside and throw rocks and criticize, but to then come in and be a part of how the church can be a force for healing and a force for transformation and for what's good in the world, right? And so it's not to see myself simply as on the receiving end or a victim of what the church has done, but also part of what is right and what the church is capable of, right? I have to be as invested in that as I am in calling out its limitations, its hypocrisies, its shortcomings. That's important, but the other piece of it is also in rebuilding it, in being a part of its holiness, if you will.
Thank you so much, President Viera,
Sure.
and thank you to everyone for those thoughtful questions. That concludes our time for Q&A. I will now turn it over to Dr. Nolasco.
Thank you, Myron Chris, for moderating that conversation. Thank you for asking those very practical, pressing questions. Thank you, President Viera, for responding to them in a very insightful, practical way. But thank you for being so open and candid about your life, about your spiritual life. Thank you as well for sharing a bit of your story, your abuelas who have impacted you greatly. We have many of those in our lives, and I'm sure that those stories we can all resonate with. Muchas gracias, President Viera, for your time, for who you are, and for leading this seminary.
Gracias a ti, Rolf, and thank you as well, Myron. Thank you for this opportunity, this privilege, and for the good work that you're doing.
Friends, our next G-Talk will be about, and get ready for this, our next G-Talk will be about the gift of loneliness. Yes, you heard it right. Next time, we're going to be talking about the gift of loneliness, featuring our very own and my dear friend, Dr. Anjo, Professor of Theology and Culture and Director of our PhD program. She will come in and converse with us about the gift of loneliness. Here, we will explore the human experience of loneliness and how we might discover the treasure that awaits us, that awaits those who do not run away from it, but treat loneliness as a guest bearing gifts. So that will be on October 13, second Wednesday at 11 a.m. with Dr. Anjo on the gift of loneliness. Dear friends, by the grace of God, may we all be awakened. May we all be awakened to the presence of God in the ordinariness of our lives, right now, right here, at this very moment. Be safe, be blessed. Until next time.